Although only 5% of the total land in the United States is designated wilderness areas, and only 2% of that is in the lower 48 states, with most of it being in Alaska, there is a push by some to include mountain biking in wilderness areas. The Wilderness Act of 1964 prohibits the use of mountain bikes in wilderness areas, and for good reason. In the act, Howard Zahniser purposely states, in order to assure that an increasing population, accompanied by an expanding settlement and growing mechanization, does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition, it is hereby declared to be the policy of Congress to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. Although the act was written over 50 years ago, its implications still hold true today. There is continuously land being developed. The population continues to grow at an alarming rate, and new technology provides the opportunity for powerfully damaging interactions with our ecosystems. Unfortunately, the Sustainable Trails Coalition, the International Mountain Biking Association, and other people are trying to change the Wilderness Act to allow mountain bikes into wilderness areas as a form of mechanization. However, if bicycles were allowed into wilderness areas, we would open up a huge potential to harm wildlife, their habitats, and other recreational users. It would also create a crowded, degraded, and chaotic trail system when a whole new recreational group was added to the mix. If hikers and cyclists were both allowed into designated wilderness areas, it would at least double the trail traffic. Bicycles can also travel much farther distances at much faster speeds than someone on foot, allowing them to access much more remote areas of wilderness, and therefore influencing wildlife. Michael J. Vandeman, author of Science Proves Mountain Biking is More Harmful Than Hiking, explains, because bikers travel faster than hikers, they may cover more ground in a given time period than hikers, thus having the opportunity to disturb more wildlife per unit of time. In Industrial Tourism and National Parks, Edward Abbey explains that distance and space are functions of speed and time. He also mentions that a motorized vehicle, when not at rest, requires a volume of space far out of proportion to its size. Although in Abbey's example he refers to a motorized vehicle rather than a bicycle, if we took this same logic and applied it to a bicycle in wilderness areas, we would see a similar result. The bicycles moving much faster and farther would take up a lot more space and make the wilderness feel crowded and smaller for both wildlife and recreational users. Edward Abbey says, to illustrate, imagine a lake approximately 10 miles long and on the average 1 mile wide. A single motorboat could easily circumnavigate the lake in an hour. 10 motorboats would begin to crowd it. 20 or 30, all in operation, would dominate the lake to the exclusion of any other form of activity. And 50 would create the hazards, confusion, and turmoil that make pleasure impossible. Mountain bikers and hikers would collectively double the trail traffic, and mountain bikes would be able to travel much deeper into the wilderness in less time. The Wilderness Act says, a wilderness, in contrast where those areas where man in his own works dominates the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man is a visitor and does not remain. Ted Stroll is the attorney and president of the Sustainable Trails Coalition in California, and author of High Country News article, It's Inevitable, There Will Be Bikes in Wilderness. When trying to defend mountain bikes in wilderness areas, he ironically says, we suspect that our opponent's fear is not that reform will fail, but that it will succeed. If we can cease limiting wilderness to methods available in biblical times, and thereby achieve better managed wilderness, with more volunteers maintaining trails and cycling visits that keep trails accessible to everyone, the previous cries of wolf will look foolish. Stroll was trying to make a point that mountain bikes in wilderness would allow for more trail maintenance and allow for more accessibility. However, the main goal in wilderness preservation is not to make trails more accessible, and it is not to put more man-hands on the trail. More people on the trail would make wilderness seem smaller, crowded, and more chaotic for wildlife and hikers. Stroll's arguments do not make sense, first of all, because everyone is allowed in wilderness, just not them and their bicycles. Second, making wilderness accessible to more people would mean a heavy burden on the ecosystems and cause further erosion, fragmentation, conversion, and alteration of the natural landscape, and it would also harm, disturb, and frighten the wildlife. Stroll's comment also portrays wolves as something bad and a cause for alarm, when anyone who has listened to science and ecology actually knows that wolves are a keystone species and are actually very good for a healthy and functioning ecosystem. Illogical arguments such as Stroll's and misleading propaganda that make mountain bikes seem less harmful should not be trusted. Another issue with allowing mountain bikes into wilderness areas is the new riding styles and technologies, including heavier weight bikes for downhill sport riding and lighter weight bikes that allow access up steeper terrain that bikes couldn't previously access. It also allows them to travel much farther. Along with these new riding styles and technologies comes an increased opportunity for trail and wildlife damage and for thrill-seeking riders to go off the trail and trample the landscape. Skiers and snowboarders sometimes duck the ropes of closed trails at ski resorts, especially the recreationists looking for thrill, speed, and adventure. How could we think that people on mountain bikes would not do the same in wilderness areas and go off the trails? A loss of control is another potential for bikers to veer off the trail and trample the landscape. Author of High Country News article, Mountain Bikes and Wilderness Don't Mix, says, "Let's be frank, backcountry biking damages the land. Bikers often veer off the trail just to keep from crashing. Mountain bikers need all that protective gear because they're not always in control. There are many negative ecological impacts that mountain bikes would have on trails, plants, animals, and their habitat if we allowed mountain bikes into wilderness areas." Riding style is a large determinant of the severity of degradation to the landscape. The greatest impacts are when riding is faster, less controlled, on steeper slopes, and in wetter conditions. However, one thing that all bicycles have in common is tires. Tires that create erosion and change the soil composition and hydrology. Because tire tracks are continuous, they create a continuous track rather than dispersed footsteps, which prevents water from infiltrating and flowing as it normally would. Michael Vandeman says, "The basic difference between tire tracks and feet is that tire tracks are continuous and foot tracks are discontinuous. Water finds that narrow continuous tire tracks are a rill in which to flow." Bicycles also have negative impacts on plants and vegetation when they trample plants on the trail and trail edges, and even worse when they veer off the trail. There is also a much greater potential to spread invasive species and plant pathogens. Since opening wilderness areas to cyclists would increase the number of people in those areas, the wildlife that lives there could be startled, crowded, disturbed, and forced out of their habitats with nowhere else to go. The New York Times article called "Leaving Only Footprints Think Again" explains how even low-impact activities like hiking, cross-country skiing, and birdwatching often affect wildlife from bighorn sheep to wolves, birds, amphibians, and tiny invertebrates in subtle ways. Author Christopher Solomon says, "You'd be surprised by the ripples left by a day hiker's ramble through the woods." In 2008, Sarah Reed, an associate conservation scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Society, and her colleagues found 5-fold declines in detections of bobcats, coyotes, and other mid-sized carnivores in protected areas of California that allowed quiet recreational activities like hiking, compared with protected areas that prohibited those activities. Certain species of wildlife depend on these untrammeled and untrampled wilderness areas for survival. When bicycles are speeding up on them and into their habitat, animals often expend extra energy to get away from the human intrusion. Howie Wolk explains, "Because mountain bikes ride fast, they startle wildlife more than hikers or horseback riders do. They also make formerly remote areas more accessible, thus reducing solitude and increasing the disturbance of wilderness-dependent species such as lynx and wolverine. Bicycles would also provide the potential to directly collide with and crush animals that fell into the same line of path as the cyclist. Although many animals will avoid the fragmented landscapes that humans travel on, some animals, such as reptiles, are actually drawn to those trails to lay in the sun. This provides the potential for reptiles sunning themselves or small animals trying to cross the trail to become crushed. Both plants and animals would be at risk of habitat alteration, conversion, and fragmentation if mountain bikes were allowed in wilderness areas. Mountain biking would also pose a large threat and disturbance to hikers and backpackers sharing the same trail. If hikers are constantly worried about a mountain bike coming up behind them or straight at them suddenly, then it would not make the hiking experience an enjoyable and relaxing recreation activity anymore. George Wuthner, ecologist and cyclist who is against mountain biking in wilderness areas, says, "On heavily used trails, the threat of a fast-moving bike changes the experience for other trail users. If you are a hiker, the ability to relax and soak in the natural world is impeded when one is anxious about having to jump out of the way of a bike." Although Wuthner is a cyclist himself, he does not support mountain biking in wilderness areas. This is actually the case throughout the mountain biking community. Some mountain bikers are against the proposition to allow mountain bikes into our wilderness areas, while others are in support of it and are trying to gain access. The people in support of mountain bike access are often misled and misinformed by the groups trying to gain access, making them think that mountain bikes are less harmful than they actually are. Michael Vanman explains how studies on mountain bike impacts, some of which were funded by the International Mountain Biking Association, have tried to make mountain biking look less harmful. He says, mountain bikers have turned to scientific research to make mountain biking seem less harmful, and in particular to studies comparing it to hiking. Some of the most important characteristics that have been ignored are speed, distance traveled, the increase in number of visitors that bikes allow, increased trail building with its attendant habitat destruction, the displacement of soil, the killing of roots and soil organisms and ecosystems, most effects on wildlife, the manner of riding, tire tread, and noise. He also explains that although bikes are somewhat quiet, the rattling chain can be perceived as alien to natural surroundings. Our mountains and wilderness areas are not just big playgrounds or outdoor gymnasiums. Although these wilderness areas are the source of enjoyment and recreation for many hikers and other low-impact activities, they are also the home and habitat to a lot of wildlife that depends on these places in their untrammeled condition. There are many other trails and places for mountain bikers to ride their bicycles. Our wilderness is the habitat to wildlife that depends on these wild places to remain healthy and functioning, and their wilderness character, without a bunch of bicycles zooming around and further fragmenting, altering, converting, and disturbing the landscape and home. If bicycles were allowed into wilderness areas, man's heavy presence would have the potential to become a resident of wilderness areas, rather than a visitor who does not remain, undermining the entire purpose of wilderness designation in the first place. We should not allow mountain bikes into our wilderness areas. Christopher Solomon explains how we need to carefully consider the goals for our wilderness areas and how recreation fits in or doesn't, because once it's allowed, it's tough to restrict. We now know that recreation is having impacts on our ecosystems in ways never imagined or predicted, and we must plan accordingly. We must not allow mountain bikes to trammel and trample our wilderness areas and the ecosystems nested within them.